welcome back to the CleanTechies Podcast. This is episode 74 of the show. I'm your host, Silas Maynor, and thank you for joining us on today's episode. Before we get into the episode details, a note from any founders listening, and then a bit from our sponsors. If you are a founder in the space and seeking funding or looking for partnerships, please do consider reaching out, as we are always doing our best to introduce founders to the capital providers that we do know, and as well make introductions to any potential partnership opportunities that might be helpful. Additionally, want to hear from our sponsors, NextWave. So thank you to NextWave partners for sponsoring the show and making it possible. NextWave are experts in talent acquisition, recruitment, and retention across climate tech, renewables, and ESG spaces globally. So if your team is growing or you personally are looking to make a career change, consider reaching out to them at www.next-wavepartners.com or reach out to one of their consultants directly via their LinkedIn page. So without any further ado, let's get into the details of today's episode. Today we are joined by Aaron Fitzgerald, the CEO and co-founder of Mars Materials. At Mars Materials, they are creating a clean acrylonitrile, or also known as ACN, alternative that is used in materials that every person on the planet, pretty much, at least he made it sound as though almost every person uses these materials every year. So ACN is, again, this material that's used in the production of things like carpet, carbon fiber products, waste treatment chemicals, keyboards, and among other things. So pretty widely used, something that not a lot of people are familiar with. But acrylonitrile is made from fossil fuels usually, and their tech is able to replace that feedstock with other materials, making it a much cleaner material. So their tech came out of NREL originally, and is a way of sequestering carbon into these everyday materials, helping reduce the carbon impacts of them. So they went to NREL and found this technology, and then went on to commercialize it through a bidding process. And in addition to this being a conversation about incredible technology, I also really enjoyed Aaron's story. It's very, very compelling, so I'm glad to be able to share that in this discussion as well. And hopefully it will inspire many people who are interested in getting into the climate tech space. So without any further delay, let's get into the conversation with Aaron Fitzgerald. All right, welcome to the show, Aaron. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. How are you, Silas?
I can't complain. The cold weather is setting in New York, but at the same time, it's an opportunity to wear boots and nice jackets. So you get to experience a little bit of different fashion, at least in my opinion. I'm really, really excited to have you on today. Really excited to talk about this. I think there's a lot of interesting things going on in the space. So why don't we just dive right in? And let's start with just kind of a quick introduction to yourself and a little bit about your background. Always really curious to understand the origin story.
Yeah, well, first, thanks for having me and for allowing me to introduce Mars Materials to your audience. And I agree with you on sweater weather. One thing I miss about California, although it's kind of always sweater weather in the Bay Area. In terms of who I am, so I'm Aaron Fitzgerald, CEO and co-founder of Mars Materials. At Mars, we are working to store captured CO2 into long-lived products like carbon fiber, wastewater treatment chemicals, and thermoplastics. So thermoplastics, in layman's terms, are like keyboard keys, upholstery, carpets, vacuum parts, etc.
Interesting. Okay, that's a lot of interesting, I guess, materials to put it into. I didn't realize that carbon could be put in those things. I'm sure we'll get into that. I do want to understand, how did you ultimately decide to get into this space? I mean, obviously, there's probably at some point in your career where you decided, hey, I want to work on something in climate. What was that?
Yeah, so I think you have to kind of rewind a bit for me. I think my journey in the climate has always been about personal responsibility and stewardship towards the planet. So in 2006, I took a alternative spring break trip with a group called Roads Rebuilt. I went to Rhodes College in Memphis, Tennessee. And we went to spent time in the 9th Ward in New Orleans about a year after Hurricane Katrina. And we were helping out folks rebuild their homes. And what was really devastating was this was my first time kind of witnessing the impact of climate devastation firsthand, and then really seeing who was impacted by this issue a year later was disappointing. So we spent about a week helping one particular lady still get water out of her house a year later. She was a Black woman, probably about mid-50s, didn't have the resources to actually like do something about it. So it was there when it kind of clicked that all the news I had heard about climate change was actually real, and it was kind of the first time I got to fully witness it. Fast forward, after that, I took just my own small personal steps to do what I could to be a better steward. At the time, it was really big to track your carbon footprint, and I made a lot of choices around where I would live and where I wouldn't do, like choosing not to drive an ICE, based off of my own kind of personal climate goals. But it wasn't until 2017, after kind of spending about 8 years or so in the professional workforce, having a stint in the US Senate, and then becoming a founder twice and for software-related businesses, that I took a trip to Lake Tahoe. And I grew up exceptionally poor. We were homeless many times, and I went to about 17 different grade schools. So I had a hugely fragmented education. And it was at Lake Tahoe that my life kind of changed. I realized that I was no longer working to escape poverty. I was in this place that is kind of hailed as being very beautiful and is different. And I read an article at the time by the Center for Carbon Removal, written by Noah Deitch, around the need to commercialize climate technologies. The thesis was, we have a lot of the technologies that we need to solve the climate crisis. What we don't have are the commercialization folks to actually do something about it. So that kind of got my wheels spinning. I moved out to California pretty shortly thereafter. And then I started to look for opportunities in climate where I could be a part of the solution. Fast forward a few years later, and here I am starting my own business. And I think what's really kind of changed is I no longer track my carbon footprint as much, partially because I learned that BP created the carbon footprint to really scapegoat to individuals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. I never heard it. Could you maybe elaborate on it a little more, just for people unfamiliar with that?
Yeah, so and forgive me if the dates are wrong, but I believe in like 2004 or so, it was a marketing effort by BP and their marketing team to create what we know as the carbon footprint. The goal was to allow individuals to feel as though they are contributing to the climate crisis by encouraging this kind of individual calculation of your climate impact. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't calculate our carbon footprint, but I think that if you have a corporation that has had an outsized influence trying to drive that narrative, there's a problem there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is actually quite interesting. I never that's something new I've learned today. One thing I'm curious a little bit about is when you moved out to California and kind of worked your way into climate, how did you find the community? Was it quite welcoming? Because obviously, this is a few years ago, so this is pretty early stage in terms of climate tech. I'm just kind of curious what the community was like, and was it welcoming? Was it hard to get in, etc.?
I would say that I really didn't join the climate community until I started Mars Materials. For the most part, I was an operator at a company looking to detect superemitting methane gas leaks, and it wasn't so much part of my identity then. I felt like I was doing good and just wanted to give back, and thought the company had a good mission and also had the potential to do financially well. So since then, I've joined the climate community in full force, and I think it's pretty welcoming.
Mm-hmm. Okay, interesting. Yeah, I've always found that, especially for myself, being somebody who had kind of no background, no education in the space, that most people are pretty chill, pretty open to chatting, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so I wanna maybe shift into a little bit more of the industry itself. So before we get into the nuances of what Mars Materials is doing, would you mind just giving us kind of a quick overview of the kind of different segments of the carbon capture space and the carbon space in general, and how it's divided? I'd be very keen to hear your explanation on that.
Yeah, so I think in the simplest of terms, and the one kind of the buckets that I look at it, you really have kind of three pathways. You have the natural solutions. So this is using existing biology to like trees to capture CO2 in plants and high carbon sink plants like switchgrass and hemp. Then you have kind of the more engineered solutions. So this is direct air capture. This is, I would say, point source capture, and then figuring out what to do with the captured CO2 once you use that engineered tool. And then you can look downstream, and that's where the utilization space comes in, or the storage space. So utilization would be utilizing that captured CO2 and turning it into useful products. The storage bit would be leveraging geological storage to permanently sequester that captured CO2. And then the last kind of bucket is more hybrid solutions. So I think of this as kind of like synbio, where you're kind of leveraging existing biological infrastructure and optimizing it to have higher uptick of CO2.
Okay, interesting. That's very helpful. I appreciate that. And then I guess one thing, I know that there's a lot of debate in the community about kind of focusing on carbon capture versus just mitigation and avoiding it in the first place. I'm curious to hear if you could at least relate to people maybe a little bit unfamiliar with it. What are the common objections to carbon capture, or the common kind of I guess beefs that people have with it they want to address usually?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the misconceptions tend to start with the history of carbon capture. It was a technology created by oil and gas to really help clean flue gas. And because of that, I think some of the misconceptions are that the carbon capture, utilization, and storage industry is a industry that is kind of a false solution and really one that will help kind of extend the longevity of oil and gas. I personally don't see it that way. I think the companies that are popping up, like Mars, are really focused on leveraging existing technologies that are out there or scaling up new technologies that might not be out there, and working to solve, the issue of CO2 drawdown. So I think that's the biggest misconception, is that this is not an oil and gas industry. It may have been started by the oil and gas industry, and some of the technologies are ones that we draw from that. But I mean, that's similar to the other legs that we stand on in society for I think products that we don't necessarily think about every day. I don't know if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. I think it is. I think it is pretty interesting. I guess it's interesting. I've never heard people mention that before. That usually it's kind of the origin of where it came from that people have an issue with. That would make a lot of sense, though, of course. So that's quite fascinating. I guess what I want to do now is get into a little bit about. I think it's pretty clear for most people listening what the purpose here is of kind of carbon capture in general, but I want to get into what Mars Material is doing in particular. So if you want to walk us through kind of step by step what is happening, maybe if you want to use one specific material as an example that we can just really understand this, somebody who's not super technical.
Yeah, so I would say we sit at the nexus of carbon removal and industrial decarbonization. And what that means is we utilize captured CO2 and we turn it into products that are really all around us. And we're able to do that because we make a compound called acrylonitrile. You can say that fast 10 times. And acrylonitrile has about 13 different downstream applications. It's really used from everything that we all know and love: our keyboard keys, our vacuums, our carpets. It's also used in things we don't see. The water that we drink that is purified from wastewater. You use something called a flocculant, which looks like effectively like a glue. You mix that into wastewater and it binds to all the solids, and you get purified water and you get that sludge. It's also used in paper pulp manufacturing. And then in the areas where we believe we will have the most impact, it's used as the sole raw material for carbon fiber. So we're pretty bullish on the idea of carbon fiber. So carbon fiber is this market that is fast growing. It's high value. So we think we can make a lot of acrylonitrile and money in that space. But downstream, there's also a lot of benefits of leveraging carbon fiber. It's a stronger and lighter material than steel, and it can be used as a replacement for steel. And so in the cases that we particularly care about, your vehicle, so your vehicles right now, ICE, internal combustion engines, electric vehicles are heavy. They're made of steel. You can replace that, the outer body, with carbon fiber to lightweight them. On the internal combustion side, that leads to improved fuel efficiency. On the electric vehicle side, that leads to a lighter vehicle and increasing the battery range of those cars.
Interesting. So, okay. So, by the way, out of curiosity, why is there is the reason that you're focused on carbon fiber because of the way it could help replace a lot of steel, and because of the kind of dirty nature, if you will, of steel, and how difficult it is to create in a clean way?
Yeah, so great question. So that really goes back to that nexus that I said I think we really sit at, that carbon removal bit, where we're able to take the captured CO2 from a producer, like a direct air capture company or someone taking it from point sources, and store it long term in a product that doesn't corrode or degrade, which is carbon fiber. And then being able to do that industrial decarbonization. So you can, replacing steel with carbon fiber allows you to reduce and lightweight, and that leads to decarbonization benefits. And from our calculations, in that one particular use case, it leads to well over a gigaton of reduced greenhouse gas emissions over a 20-year period between 2030 and 2050. We also see other opportunities for carbon fiber replacing steel and building materials, for example, like structural and amendments, thinking of like mixing with concrete. We also see opportunities applying carbon fiber to transmission lines. This was tested in Texas, where the American Electric Power Company replaced 250 miles of their steel reinforced conductor transmission lines with carbon fiber, and they saw an increase in line capacity and a decrease in line loss. So as we are thinking about the future, and we see estimates of our the energy usage on the grid, I think is expected to triple over the next 20, 30 years. We're going to need new power infrastructure, so we think carbon fiber can be useful there. And then you're right, steel itself is really hard to decarbonize. There's a pretty well-known and tried-true process for making steel. And it has a lot of toxic and harmful byproducts, including greenhouse gases. And if we can chip away at the demand for it, we see a lot of opportunity there.
Interesting. This is fascinating. One thing I'm curious about is if, kind of, even if you take away the environmental benefits of using, a kind of a carbon fiber product that's, better for the environment, if it's stronger and has better benefits than steel, is there a reason why it hasn't become more widely used already? Is there a cost reason that's kind of going along with this?
Yeah, so if you look at the carbon fiber supply chain, it really starts with acrylonitrile and the raw materials that it takes to get to acrylonitrile and the processes to do that. So there's a bottleneck in that particular part of the supply chain. So the existing acrylonitrile supply chain, you create acrylonitrile today using crude oil. Crude oil is then converted into propylene, and then propylene is run through a chemical reaction called ammoxidation that also leverages ammonia to create acrylonitrile. So all of the world's acrylonitrile, about 95% of it, is derived from this process. And 90% of the world's carbon fiber is derived from acrylonitrile. So you then take the acrylonitrile, you polymerize it. So effectively you bind it with itself and you get a solid. So it looks like a liquid, then you get a solid. And then you effectively bake it, or in technical terms, you carbonize it, and then you get carbon fiber. That carbon fiber today, which if you're following along, it effectively means all of our carbon fiber is made from fossil fuels. And then as you look downstream, you then have to figure out how to mold the carbon fiber and make it into the useful parts and equipment that you would need, that we're also already able to do with steel. So along that whole value chain, there is work to be done. But why we're really excited about starting up that chain, really focused on carbon fiber, is a lot of the emissions intensity and the actual material itself. If you can make it from a non-fossil fuel derived system, you're already changing a lot of the carbon embodiment. Now, as you go downstream for carbon fiber, that carbonization process, or where you're baking it, requires a lot of energy. So you do have a high energy intensity process. But the future that we hope that we can participate in building is one where we have a 100% renewable grid. So that kind of removes some of that need. And then as we look further downstream, we see a lot of opportunity in several startup companies and the carbon fiber manufacturers themselves looking to improve manufacturing processes, including molding, to make that more efficient and more standardized.
So I just want to make sure I understood this correctly. The process that you're using to create this, I'm not going to get the chemical term right, to create this is helping remove fossil fuels from the equation. Did I understand that correctly?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
And we're able to, our raw materials are captured CO2 and then bio-derived ethanol. So corn sugars.
Okay. So not only you're getting rid of, okay, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. Okay. One thing I wanted to understand is also how are you making these kind of get into the applications? Are you just selling the chemical as a product to be integrated into other manufacturers' processes? Are you taking on the kind of the challenge of figuring out how to fuse these technologies together to input this into those technologies, et cetera? I'm just kind of curious about this.
Yeah, so at Mars, we see ourselves today as a technology development shop. And with the early foundations, we're becoming a project developer. So today we are working to scale up an alternative process to create acrylonitrile. You can also call it ACN. Our process differs from the existing industrial incumbent, which again uses crude oil and converts that into acrylonitrile, where we take captured CO2, we take bio-derived ethanol, we process it through a commercial scale reaction to create the main feedstock for the nitrilation technology that we're working to scale up. Then we process the acrylonitrile that we create, and we can further process that to polyacrylonitrile if we want to. But our plans today are just to create the acrylonitrile and to sell that to the carbon fiber manufacturers. And they have their own spinning techniques to create the polyacrylonitrile. So effectively what we are creating is a drop-in replacement acrylonitrile material. And the advantage there is that it's renewable. We are able to use multiple feedstocks. So whereas the traditional incumbent process is really beholden to the crude oil fossil fuel chain, we can be more flexible there. Because our process was designed under the principles of green chemistry, it doesn't have toxic byproducts or waste. Some of the inputs that we use, like ammonia, can be recycled. It changes the whole life cycle of the material. And we see all of those advantages as being important and helpful for the carbon fiber industry. And we're learning that from the manufacturers that this is something that they're looking for.
Interesting. So it's kind of as if the need or the desire to have this product is already there. You just have to meet the demand. One thing I'm curious about is how ultimately did you come across this technology? Was this something that you had an idea about and you went through an R&D process? Was there a non-commercialized technology that you were able to get from a lab? I'm not sure how this thing works. I'm actually always very curious about this science stuff that I have no clue on.
Yeah, so yeah, I don't know where your audience is coming from, but again, I used to work in the U.S. Senate, and I'm a big fan of American innovation and what this country has done and what we can do. And one thing that we have is a really incredible national lab system. There are about 17 national labs across the U.S., and they create technologies that are just really game changing. When I say game changing, I like literally mean can like morph entire industries. But unfortunately, one of the challenges that we have is that a lot of these technologies get shelved, or large enterprises will kind of acquire them and just to take them out of the equation. So I was fortunate enough to be a fellow with a group called Carbon 180, which is a DC-based think tank focused on creating the carbon economy. And during that program, I was charged with identifying technologies and business models that could help me build a company that could remove 1 billion tons of captured CO2 from the air by 2050. I personally wanted to work on this nexus of carbon removal and decarbonization, industrial decarbonization. And so I put out effectively an RFI across the various national labs. I was given about 18 different process technologies that me and my co-founder, Christian Gupsh, reviewed. We put them through a market-focused framework where we first looked at the market potential for some of these technologies and had to assess whether they had what could be a VC backable kind of market. And then we looked for technologies that markets within those submarkets that could be good beachheads. So it could sustain some of those higher costs while you're looking to scale your technology up and drive those costs down. And then we created several feasibility studies, a science feasibility study that looked at, are there any fundamental gaps that we have to address? An engineering feasibility study. What does this process look like scaled up, and what type of equipment will we need? An economic one, will this be competitive in the market? Because we're at the end of the day selling commodities, and that's all that's important. And then lastly was a commercialization timeline. How much capital is required? What's the team makeup look like? And across all of those levers, nitrilation was the outstanding technology that we selected. And it was created by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, or NREL. And NREL is notorious for creating just incredible technologies and usually for energy. And so nitrilation was kind of an interesting technology for them. But we were invited to work with NREL through a program called LabStart. So LabStart and Carbon 180 partnered together, and myself and 3 other Carbon 180 entrepreneur residences participated in this pilot program. And Mars was the company that ended up spinning one of the technologies out.
Well, that's quite fascinating. I wasn't aware of this I knew of NREL, but I wasn't aware of this kind of great infrastructure. So it sounds like there's potentially a lot of technologies that could be commercialized there if they had the right people behind it. I am curious, you mentioned that you had a bit of time working in the Senate. Was that time like really helpful for you to understand how this entire kind of I don't know how you would call it, like almost like the back office works for getting things like this moving and the grants and everything like that? Because a lot of these technologies, they're not they may require some more R&D usually, I think, in order to get them going. So I'm just kind of curious how that experience helped you to achieve and do what you're doing now.
Yeah, I think the Senate taught me about all of the red tape that exists in the world, and or at least here in the US, and how to navigate it and how to really speak through it. You know, so much I think of my job is to remove that red tape. So I often find myself falling back on a lot of the experiences I've learned in politics to really break through the noise. But I've also been a founder twice, so I'm able to pull from that experience as well. Whereas the Senate's very entrenched and, it has its way of doing business, and the startup, you're figuring out things on the fly. So I think being able to understand how, rigid systems work, but also have that comfort in being flexible from my startup experience has kind of served me well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's quite fascinating, really, the kind of the fusion of government and bureaucracy with startups and innovation. It's obviously kind of very antithetical to each other, right? But obviously, without the R&D funding, we probably wouldn't have a lot of these technologies
It
that
shouldn't
have
be,
come out.
though. If you really think about it, a market has rules inherently. Those rules are set by some entity. I think what's the challenge is that we've become a little risk adverse, and we try to regulate so many things in a way that makes it really hard for startups to kind of come in. But I think there's a lot of opportunity now. The Lab Start is a program that is really meant to help founders kind of break through that noise, and to help them give the tools that they need to converse with those national labs, and to allow them to kind of stand up on their own 2 feet. And I think it's also important to think about like what the national labs are. They're funded by taxpayer dollars. So if there's issues of our technology leaving the coast of the US and going to China, like they're going to be pretty risk adverse and a little afraid of that, because that means that all the taxpayer dollars that went into this is not actually going to benefit us. So I think when entrepreneurs come and try to partner with the government, you just have to kind of remember where the government's coming from.
Mm-hmm. That makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think there can be improvements on kind of making things a bit more quick, especially you mentioned regulation, or I always have this opinion that regulation needs to be more adaptable to realizing when they got it wrong and how to make adjustments to actually kind of achieve the outcome, because oftentimes it's just very it's kind of set in stone once you do it, and people don't really want to change it. It's very difficult to change. So that is quite fascinating. Obviously, kind of while we're on this topic, I would be keen if there's other people in the space who have an interest to look into these technologies that are kind of on the shelf waiting to be commercialized. What are the typical things, or the bare minimum requirements for people to get into this program, or to look into this, that they might be able to start this?
Yeah, so I think you just go to labstart.org and reach out to the team there, and let them know of your interests and what you're trying to do, and they can help you get matched to the various. But I think as you find a technology that you might be interested in settling on, it's really important to develop the relationships with the technology licensing officers, who you're going to be negotiating with on the business transaction to get access to the technology. It's also important to build good rapport with the principal investigators, or in layman's term, the inventors, so that you're able to fully understand the technology and where it is, and get and be able to like speak articulately with them. But then also understand that these national labs have rules around how they are governed to license technology. And they look at kind of 2 criterion, and it's the capacity and the commitment. And I think those are unfortunately ill-defined. But if you're able to kind of create a system around that, I think it makes it more, I think it makes it easy, or easier than what it would be. So from my perspective, capacity is, do you have the right team in place? Do you have the right resources in place to make your vision a reality? And that commitment is, what will it take to get you to bring this to market? Are you going to stop at nothing? Because that's kind of what the lab system wants to see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, quite fascinating. I think I definitely recommend, if there's any entrepreneurs wanting to go into climate and do something, especially people who've commercialized something before, consider looking into this. I do want to talk about, we kind of touched it, but talk about the funding process and getting things up and running, especially at the beginning when there's no immediate path to kind of getting sales out the door. So I'm just kind of curious, could you walk us through the challenges of funding, and kind of how you went through it, and what the path forward might look like from this point?
Yeah, so I think moving from software and then into which is the companies that I started, and then moving into climate, where I worked as a PM for a company that could detect super-emitting methane gas leaks over in oil and gas fields. I just learned how different the industries are, and the timelines are quite challenging. What I didn't really anticipate when I started Mars after leaving that firm was how long it would take before we are perhaps even processing our first bit of captured CO2 into products. So I think from a mental perspective, just be prepared that this takes a lot longer. And then from a capital perspective, you have to get creative. So the nice thing about, I think, these businesses, particularly when you're talking about making material, is that we have made things throughout our entire human existence, right? Since we first started making tools. Making software is actually pretty new. So there's a lot of infrastructure and a lot of precedent for how to build a chemical industry, because we had to do that 100 years ago. But what we all know is that it takes a lot of money. That doesn't always fit with the venture capital style returns. So the first thing I would say is look for investors, if that's the route you want to go first, that are looking more long-term and aligned with what you're doing. So our mission is climate. We are focused on removing and sequestering greenhouse gases and commercializing technologies that can do that. Our focus is to do that by turning the industrial supply chain into carbon sinks. So we've been fortunate enough to find investors who are aligned with that goal. So they are more comfortable with that long-term timeline. We're also thinking more creatively outside of just general investment dollars, and we've looked for grants. So, my Carbon 180 fellowship came with a grant stipend that I was able to apply to Mars. I was also an entrepreneur in residence with Prime Coalition, and they have a VC fund called Azola Ventures. And that as a fellow, I was able to get access to a stipend that I was also able to funnel into Mars, and that was grant money, non-dilutive, that was able to get us off the ground and achieve some of our early engineering goals. With that, and a lot of the goals that we were achieving on our own, investors took notice, and that's when we were able to begin kind of having those conversations and in closing our pre-seed as we did back in April. And then further, recently it was announced that we are participants in the Breakthrough Energy Fellows Program. And that comes with non-dilutive monies for technology development and scale up. So this allows a grant that we don't necessarily have to pay back be a way to mitigate technology risks that venture capitalists aren't necessarily comfortable taking the bill for it.
Mm-hmm. Are there a lot of resources to help identify where you can find those grants? It sounds like, you've mentioned 3 of them already. So I'm curious, I'm assuming there's quite a good number of them out there, but how do you go about finding those aside from, the opportunities that you were in?
Yeah, I think at the core of every startup is this kind of R&D discovery engine. So the way we have structured our company is we just take information in. So we have figured out ways to take in massive amounts of data from various sources, friends and family and industry partners and connections, and really just sift through different opportunities. Not everyone aligns with what we want, and some of them may not be worth the time, so we don't necessarily pursue them. But I would just say keep an open ear out. I did name a couple programs that I was a part of that have been helpful and instrumental to getting Mars to where it is today. But to be honest, I think if I were looking at the landscape today, it would look a lot different than when I started the company 3 years ago. There weren't many opportunities there. So when I go and check for kind of early stage grants, I just see so many. So Open Grants is a platform that has the capacity for that. If you're based in California, you may be able to tap into the CalSeed network. And NYSERDA with New York, they've been a great partner for us. I don't think there's a shortage of opportunities. It's just more so, how do you find the one that fits?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it is because there's obviously it's not like one size fits all in climate tech, right? It's not software altogether, right? There's a lot of hardware involved and it's got its own technical challenges. So I'm assuming there's a lot of different things there. One thing I did want to ask about because I know that maybe not so much as of late, but in the past year or two, there've been I've seen kind of discussion around some of the traditional VCs and private equity funds entering climate tech and not being familiar with the model, as it sounded like you mentioned. Were there ever situations where you ended up trying to kind of turning down an eager partner just because you didn't necessarily feel that they truly understood that the risks are going to be different and the outcomes are going to take kind of longer to achieve?
Well, I'll first say that I am a Black queer founder, so my experience into the world of capital is very different. Sometimes I feel like we are having to just kind of take what's offered to us. I ended up pitching 154 investors before we got our first yes. We ended up then getting 9 investors on our cap table, and we are so fortunate to have them. They're great partners. But so I don't think that question necessarily applies to me. I just didn't give up because I know what I'm trying to do and what my team and I have the capacity to do, and we weren't going to let anyone stop us.
And would you say that was it about the timing about when you were going through that process that just people weren't ready for this type of technology? What was the key reason that people tended to turn it away? And was there a lot of constructive feedback as to you could implement and adjust to go forward with your next pitches? Or what was the key reason that you really found there?
Yeah, I would have to look back at my spreadsheet to see which ones ghosted us and what percentage that was. I would say about half of them probably did.
Mm.
Um, Others perhaps wasted our time and were asking questions but never intended to invest. And we got smart around that and began to play the game a little better. I think a lot of the objections were around our approach, right? Like a lot of the existing kind of carbon tech as part of the general CCUS space is really focused around chemicals and compounds that we all know, talking about sustainable aviation fuel, some of those precursors, ethanol, other kind of like solid-based materials. But we were talking about acrylonitrile, and folks were like, what is that? So we had to educate them on this really wonder compound that is present in all of our lives. It's estimated that every person on the planet consumes about a kilogram of it per year. But folks weren't aware of it, right? And I think that is the case across the entire supply chain. There are so many chemicals and compounds and materials that go into our modern lives that people just don't think about. And so many of them are derived from fossil fuels, and we just don't know. So part of it was having to educate some of the smartest people in the room, right? Like VCs tend to be, very, very smart and aware of things. And here we were coming with a idea that they had perhaps kind of overlooked. So I think there was just a lot of confusion there. So what we did is we just went back to the drawing board. We refined our messaging. We, figured out how to talk about it in more layman's terms, and that we found success then.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that does make sense. I have noticed this in a few of other discussions I've had, not necessarily on the podcast, but it seems as though climate tech requires a bit more of I guess you could say, a more sophisticated VC because it's not the same business model every time, right? It's not just about product market fit; it's about a lot of other things. That is really fascinating to hear. I really appreciate you sharing that. Um, One thing I did want to touch on too was, and again, I could be completely off here, so if I'm wrong, we can just kind of skip over it. But given that this I'm just going to say ACN is used in a lot of products already, and if you're creating if I'm not, maybe I'm mischaracterizing the term, but a carbon neutral version of this, I don't know if that's the right term to use, would companies that are creating these products be eligible for carbon credits based off of the fact that they're reducing from a baseline of what they were previously producing?
Yeah, so we are able to store captured CO2 into the downstream products created by acrylonitrile or ACN. We would not say that our process is carbon neutral. We hope to get there with process optimizations and efficiencies and proper sourcing techniques. And with that, we're driven by our techno-economic assessment and our developing life cycle assessment to make those calls. In terms of our product, it is a drop-in replacement technology. The IRA, which I do not claim to be an expert on, we are actually now working with the Breakthrough Energy Fellows Program, one of the business fellows there, to help us figure out which credits we can tap into. I would say that for us, the reason why we were really excited about nitrilation, really going back to us, that technology selection process, was that we didn't want to have to build or design a business around credits. It's just not something that we thought the market would celebrate. So our technology, our reaction chemistry, is more efficient. It has higher conversions, higher yields. So that leads to a potentially, cheaper acrylonitrile. So that's really what we hang our hats on. With that said, credits are not a bad thing because they can improve the economics further. And we're looking for ways to see how we can tap into some of those like 45Q credits, how we can tap into, I think it's 45W credits for manufacturing to make our economics even more, appealing towards investors and customers.
Mm-hmm. Okay, interesting. Yeah, that is fascinating. So just maybe clarify one thing you said there was your goal is to get to a point where it's actually a cheaper alternative and a cleaner alternative. You're still working on that process to get there, correct?
Correct. Yeah. So
Okay.
it's going to require achieving scale and that scale in manufacturing, but also in our supply chain procurement process and making sure we have, a system in place and not just buying some of our, input materials when we're producing grams from, kind of smaller purchasers with markups.
Yeah, I think it is an interesting, the whole supply chain for this space. Obviously, it's difficult because everything is really specialized, and sometimes these startups are doing something that's so out of the box. There's not even an adjacent industry that they can kind of tap into. So I do think it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out for yourself and then for others in the space. One thing that I'm just noticing is, like, obviously you have been able to talk about a lot of things here. I'm really curious your process of how did you learn all these things? Like, how do you go about getting the knowledge to be able to speak on these things? Was it because of your educational background? How are you able to kind of keep up and learn all these extremely technical things as a founder in the space? I'm sure a lot of people are wondering the same thing.
Yeah, so I mentioned I had a fragmented grade school education. Between my siblings, we count that we went to 17 different grade schools. I studied business in college. I think for me, it's always been curiosity. I think when you grow up in a survival mentality, particularly when we're jumping from school to school, and some schools we go to would be way further ahead than what we had just learned at another place. We had to teach ourselves. And I think I have just learned how I learn. A lot of that's just through experiential learning and just kind of diving right in and wanting to solve problems. And that's kind of how I look at it. I see myself as a problem solver. If I don't know something, I'm going to dive in and do what I can to learn. I build community around that. When I create when we were creating our science feasibility studies, we talked to folks who had PhDs in the areas that we were focusing on to help us design those studies and to give us insights. And they became my teachers. So I think as long as you're willing to learn and you're comfortable sharing what you don't know, people are usually willing to give you time.
Mm-hmm. Is there a specific, like, maybe, while you're doing the course or something, one problem comes up or one topic comes up you're not familiar with? Do you have a particular regiment or type of thing that like a process you follow to go fill in the gaps? Is there, certain I'm just really curious about the process because I also am somebody who just constantly wants to learn new things, right? So I'm just curious to maybe add this for myself. This might be a selfish question.
Yeah, that's a great question. If I had to describe my framework, I mean, I think it's usually there's a deadline. I need to learn something. I don't know what it is I need to learn, so I kind of just start with a guess. That guess usually leads me to a paper or a peer-reviewed journal, and I read the abstract, and the abstract often doesn't make sense. So then I will dive deeper into the paper until it does. And then I look at the sources and the references from those papers and I read those. And then I start to understand and connect the dots between, I think, those different sources of information, and then pulling in what I know, using then what I just learned and what I know to help unblock me. And when I say pulling in what I just learned, that can be from papers, it could be from people and experts, or even just from my surroundings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it is really fascinating. It's something maybe we could kind of segue into this next question, which is, I do think a lot of people need to still learn the art. I obviously we have the internet and there's a lot of information out there, and obviously there's experts now we have access to, but I think a lot of people still need to learn the art of how to constantly learn and how to go and seek, um, kind of identify what are the dark corners I'm not aware of, because if you don't know what you don't know, you at least have to, like you said, have a guess of some sort, right, using your existing knowledge. So I think that that's really fascinating. I really appreciate you sharing that. I guess I kind of want to start winding things down here. So to close things off, I'd be curious to know, for people who are really interested in the space, really interested to get into it. Speaking of learning, what would you recommend for people to do? Perhaps high school students looking to get into the space, maybe things they want to prepare for, specific university tracks to go down. I'm just kind of curious to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, so I think one of the more tragic things about where we are as a country is that we've lost really 2 decades of manufacturing. So there's a big gap between the experts who are now retiring and folks leaving university. And so I think there's no better time for young people to, if they want to do more formal training, go into professions like chemical engineering, where I think those are going to be the engineering rock stars of the future, similar to what software engineers were in 2000 and 2010s. I think that for folks who don't want to do more engineering related work, we will need people who can navigate the red tape and the bureaucracy. So I don't think that requires a formalized degree to study, but it does require, I think, unique experiences that have put you in touch with red tape, and you've learned how to break those down. So that could come from, an internship on the Hill. It could come from working for NYSERDA or working for a startup. I think you'll learn those skills on the fly. So I don't think there's a shortage of the type of work that's available. I think it really becomes finding your path, figuring out what in climate excites you, and then being excited around solving a particular problem. If Mars doesn't work out, the way I see it is that there is no shortage of problems. There's probably about 1,000 other problems that can go solve in climate that could also have an impact. So really just kind of frame your thinking around that, and then build in the skills that you need. And that can come from a formalized education. It could come from, just kind of diving in and learning.
Mm-hmm. Very good. I appreciate that. That is, I really like the outlook. I think it's very helpful. Hopefully a lot of people find that interesting and pursue something like that. I guess to just button things up here, what are any final thoughts you want to offer to people? Maybe things we missed, thoughts on the future of the carbon space, etc.
Yeah, I think that if you don't feel like you have a place in climate, and Mars has available opportunities, please check out our job boards. We're at marsmaterials.tech, and our job board is /jobs. In terms of kind of what's next for us and how I think the greater climate community is also being involved. We are participating in the Breakthrough Energy Fellows program for the next 2 years, working to mature our technology. And we see a lot of opportunity, not to just do good in our company, but like the community that we are now a part of, all of these innovators who are also committed and focused on industrial decarbonization is really inspiring. And I would say, for folks who are, unsure or uncomfortable about kind of the direction that we're in, there's no better time to jump in and to be part of the solution. It's very easy to feel hopeless and like there isn't nothing, like little climate action you can do. But I think the true unsung heroes are the folks who are in the background, really removing all this red tape to make it possible to make the things that we all know and love in a different, more sustainable way that can also lead to, climate impact. So if that's you, there is no shortage of opportunities. It really just becomes finding the right kind of needle in a haystack or creating your own. And that's going to take some time, and it might be a little painful. Trust me, it's difficult, but the opportunity is there. And if it's not there, check out our job board because I'll have one for you.
Yeah, I do think it's interesting for people, if they're not familiar, to at least try out if they don't know where they want to start or something that they want to start something but not sure where to go. Definitely get an opportunity in some space that kind of maybe narrow it down to 3 spaces that are interesting to you, and from there you'll learn some expertise. Maybe you go into a conventional industry you want to change, right? Most of the people I've had on the podcast were in some kind of conventional industry and then they made an incredible innovation in it, right? So I think it's fascinating. Sometimes the new sexy thing isn't actually the place for the opportunity. Perhaps it's the old thing that's really dusty in the corner, right? So anyways, well, I really appreciate you coming out. This has been a really great conversation, Aaron, and I'm looking forward to seeing how you guys continue to grow in the future.
Thank you so much for the opportunity, Silas, and really great time connecting with you and sharing Mars materials with your audience. So you have a lovely rest of your day.
Awesome. You too. All right, thank you so much for tuning in to today's episode of the podcast. If you enjoyed, please do share this with somebody who might enjoy it. Please also leave a review if you enjoyed it. It really, those things collectively help us to grow the show significantly, so really do appreciate that. And then definitely reach out and connect with Aaron to learn more about what they're doing. And of course, check out their website at Mars Material to learn more about what they're doing. And if you're interested in getting involved, I know they mentioned they're hiring, so definitely consider learning more there. And if this is your first time, please do subscribe and tap the bell for notifications to follow along on our journey. Just a quick note, our next episode will be with Al Sabloy, the CEO and founder of Butterfly. They, in essence, they are a turnkey building efficiency and decarbonization platform for certain types of commercial buildings. My understanding is they do a lot of work with franchise operators, for example. And what they're doing is taking on the entire capital expenditure of installing the equipment for solar as well as all of the energy efficiency equipment. And then they charge their customers a monthly bill like an electricity bill, except lower and from clean energy sources. So the big innovation here is the lack of a barrier to get started by removing that upfront CapEx kind of costs for the client. And generally speaking, it's really, taking off. So it's a really fascinating episode with Al. Really did enjoy this one, certainly. So stay tuned for that. And thanks again for joining us on CleanTechies the podcast. We will see you next time.